The crash didn't make a sound anyone could hear, not out here. The forest just trembled slightly, birds startled into flight, a few leaves drifting down in the blast's wake. The thing had fallen from the upper atmosphere like a dying comet, carving through clouds and treetops, before gouging a deep trench into the soil of Central Oregon's protected wilderness. Zaren Dorsey had not seen the crash, but his dog, Kip, whined and tugged at the leash hard enough to nearly dislocate his shoulder. "Hey, I'm not built for chasing squirrels through lava rock, all right?" Zaren crouched beside Kip, rubbing the dog's ears. "Where are you trying to go?" Kip gave a low growl, his wiry frame trembling with tension, and then bolted toward the east, the leash yanked from Zaren's hand. He cursed and sprinted after him, branches lashing his arms and face. He wasn't dressed for this, just a light jacket, hiking boots, and cargo pants smeared with pine sap and dust from earlier trail maintenance. He found Kip standing at the edge of a jagged gash in the forest. Smoke curled from the upturned earth. Something metallic and scorched lay half buried in the dirt, its hull cracked open like a broken egg. Zaren froze. Something moved. He stepped closer, heart thudding against his ribs, and that's when he saw it curled at the base of the wreckage, barely breathing. It looked like a tiger, or something akin to one, but bulkier, with armor like scales along its spine and two sets of eyes layered vertically. One of its back legs was bent at a sickening angle, exposed muscle glistening beneath torn fur. Kip whimpered, ears flat. Zaren dropped to one knee, trying not to startle the creature. "Hey, buddy, easy." The alien tiger, if that's what it was, lifted its head and let out a low, rumbling growl. Not a warning, more like a cry of pain. Its chest heaved with each shallow breath. Zaren scanned the surroundings. No other movement. No rescue team, no drones, nothing. "Guess you're on your own," he muttered, then stood. "All right, I'm gonna get help." He ran 2 miles back to camp, lungs burning, only to find the emergency comms still down from last night's storm. His satellite beacon was toast. His phone had no signal this deep in the reserve. He grabbed his med kit and a few protein bars, filled a canteen, then sprinted back. The tiger hadn't moved. Its eyes tracked him as he approached, slow and careful. Blood had pooled beneath its leg. "I'm not here to hurt you," Zaren said. "You're not exactly a bear, but I figure this works the same way." He opened the kit and pulled out gauze, antiseptic spray, and a pressure bandage. The creature flinched but didn't attack. It let him touch the leg, allowed him to clean and wrap the wound. When he finished, it gave a low groan and collapsed fully on its side. For the next 2 days, Zaren stayed nearby. He built a lean-to for shelter, rationed food, and kept the fire small. The tiger, he named it Veyor, ate from his hand eventually, though it only tolerated his touch when cleaning the wound. He tried whistling once. Veyor tilted its head, puzzled, then turned away. On the 3rd day, a black transport ship descended over the treetops. It came without warning, hovering silently before releasing a small scouting craft that zipped toward the crater. Zaren stood, hands raised. 4 figures emerged, tall and humanoid, wearing armor that shimmered like oil on water. Their leader scanned the wreck and the tiger, then turned to Zaren. "You are the one who found the survivor," Zaren nodded. "I've been keeping it stable. Veyor's leg is broken, badly. You administered care." "Yeah, I'm not a vet, but I did what I could." The alien's face was unreadable. "And you are aware this is a classified species under the Galactic Preservation Accord?" "No one told me," Zaren said. "There were no signs, no warning. I just saw something suffering." The alien knelt beside Veyor, scanning the injury. "The fracture is severe. Without surgical intervention, survival is unlikely, but you prevented infection. You stabilized the bleeding." Veyor growled softly but didn't resist. Another alien approached. "Protocol dictates we do not interfere with non-registered species unless provoked." This creature's crash was a result of unauthorized travel through Earth's atmosphere. Zaren stepped forward. "So you're telling me you would have left him here to die? That is not your concern." "Well, it is now," Zaren snapped. I've been feeding him, sleeping out here, cleaning a wound that smells like rot. If you're not going to help him, then I will. But I need more supplies. A splint, antibiotics, something?" The leader hesitated. "You are not authorized." "I didn't ask for authorization," Zaren said. "I asked for help." The aliens conferred in low tones, then the leader turned back. "You are permitted to continue care. We will supply basic medical equipment. Veyor has bonded with you in a primary trust formation. Relocation would disrupt recovery." Zaren blinked. "Wait, he trusts me?" "Yes." "That is uncommon." The aliens unloaded a small crate before leaving. The ship vanished into the sky without another word. Over the next week, Zaren worked tirelessly. The new supplies helped, but Veyor's leg needed real alignment. He used a splint, braces, and cold compresses fashioned from river stones. He read veterinary manuals nightly by flashlight, adapting techniques where he could. Kip remained close, always watching Veyor but never barking again. One morning, as Zaren adjusted the splint, Veyor let out a short, clip sound. Not quite a growl, not a cry either. Zaren paused. "You okay?" Veyor's head moved, eyes locking with his. Then, slowly, the creature extended one massive paw and tapped Zaren's chest. Once, Zaren blinked. Was that? "Thanks." Veyor closed his eyes. Recovery was slow. By the third week, Veyor could sit up without groaning. Zaren checked the leg daily, noting the swelling had gone down. He remained cautious. Not every animal that accepts help understands boundaries. Then the researchers came. They didn't wear armor, just dark uniforms marked with the symbol of the Intergalactic Zoological Commission. Their ship was larger, equipped with cranes and holding cells. When they approached the crater, Zaren blocked the path. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but he's not going anywhere." "We are here on official directive," the lead researcher said. "The creature is a misclassified apex predator. Its presence here violates interstellar conservation laws. You're too late." "He's recovering. We were not informed of any human involvement." "Well, I'm involved," Zaren said, "and I'm not letting you take him until he's healed." The researcher scowled. "You are obstructing a lawful recovery. I'm protecting a patient." A tense silence followed. Then Veyor stood. The tiger's movements were clumsy, its legs still partially bound, but it moved forward anyway. It placed itself between Zaren and the researchers, growling low and deep. The researcher backed up. "I believe," Zaren said, "you're not welcome here." The team retreated. Their ship lifted off without further argument. Afterward, Zaren collapsed against a rock, sweat pouring down his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said to Veyor. Veyor blinked, then lay beside him. The next few days passed quietly. Veyor's strength returned slowly. He limped less, ate more. The forest, once silent, now buzzed with life around them again. And for the first time in weeks, Zaren allowed himself to rest. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge, Zaren had constructed a crude pulley system to help Veyor navigate the slope behind the crater. The leg, although stronger, couldn't bear full weight for long stretches, and the uneven terrain made every step a gamble. Shift left. "No, your other left." Zaren tugged the rope taut, guiding the harness around a mossy outcrop. Veyor growled, not in pain this time, but with the unmistakable aggravation of someone being told how to walk. "You volunteered for this hill," Zaren grunted, bracing himself against a tree. "I wanted to stay by the stream." Kip barked once from the top, tail wagging like he'd accomplished something. Veyor paused halfway up and stared at the terrier with what could only be described as disdain. By late afternoon, the climb was complete, and they reached a ledge that overlooked the valley beyond. From this height, the forest unfurled in every direction, a rippling sea of green and gold. It was the first time Veyor had seen the horizon clearly since the crash. "You like it?" Zaren sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. Veyor didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. He watched the sun dip behind the mountains, the glow catching in the thin fur around his neck, casting him in bronze. The next morning, Zaren woke to the sound of plastic crinkling. He turned to find Veyor nosing through his pack, already halfway into a bag of dried lentils. "I was saving those," he muttered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Veyor didn't look up. "You don't even like lentils." Still no reaction. "Fine. But you're on latrine duty for the rest of the week." By midday, they were back near the crash site. Zaren had begun cataloging the debris, not for salvage but for curiosity. The hull shrapnel bore etchings patterns resembling veins, but too symmetrical for anything organic. He used a charcoal pencil and his trail journal to sketch them out. Veyor didn't stop him, but he watched closely, eyes flicking between the markings and Zaren's page. "You recognize these?" Veyor's ears twitched. "Are they language? Or something else?" This time, Veyor reached out with a claw and tapped the second pattern Zaren had drawn. "All right, so that one means something. Can you?" He paused, then flipped the page and drew a crude stick figure with a backpack. "That's me." Veyor looked, then extended a paw and dragged it across the drawing, slicing the figure in half. Zaren blinked. "Charming." Veyor sat back unbothered. An hour later, a sharp whine buzzed through the air like a mosquito on amphetamines. Zaren ducked instinctively, and Veyor dropped into a crouch, hackles rising. A drone the size of a raccoon zipped overhead, hovering briefly before lowering a small canister onto the dirt. It hissed, then projected a hologram flickering, blurry, but unmistakably humanoid. "Zaren Dorsey," the projection said, "still not used to hearing my name from space," Zaren muttered. "You are requested to submit a biological profile of the entity designated as Veyor." Zaren crossed his arms. "And if I don't, the Intergalactic Zoological Commission will classify your actions as obstruction of scientific process. Compliance is encouraged." The hologram vanished. Zaren turned to Veyor. "They want your medical records," Veyor huffed. "Not a fan of paperwork either." That night, Zaren dug through his notes. He'd been documenting Veyor's progress in a notebook: muscle regression, appetite changes, tissue regrowth rates. He'd even logged the rate at which the creature's fur grew back over the wound. It was astonishing. Faster than any mammal he'd studied. He paged through the entries, then stopped. There. Day 12. Scar tissue around the femur had developed a secondary layer, something like cartilage, but denser, almost metallic in sheen. He'd thought it was a trick of the flashlight. Now, under the glow of his headlamp, it shimmered faintly. Zaren looked at Veyor, who was asleep near the fire, breathing slow and deep. "You're not just healing," he whispered. "You're upgrading." 2 days later, the drone returned. This time, it didn't drop a message. It released a net. It snapped open midair, descending fast. Zaren shouted, diving forward as it closed around Veyor. The creature roared, twisting violently, but the net's threads glowed with a green pulse and tightened. Zaren grabbed a hatchet from the gear pile and hacked at the cords. Sparks flew. Veyor thrashed, his claws useless against the reactive mesh. Kip barked furiously, dodging the flailing limbs. "Hold still," Zaren yelled, slicing again. One thread gave way, then another. The net faltered. Veyor lunged, snapping the remaining filaments with a burst of raw force and rolling clear of the trap. The drone, recognizing failure, zipped upward. Zaren hurled the hatchet. It struck the drone's rear panel, knocking it into a spin. The machine sputtered and veered into a tree, exploding in a shower of sparks and bark. Veyor panted heavily, one flank scorched where the net had burned him. Zaren crouched beside him. "You all right?" Veyor didn't respond. He stared at the wreckage. "That's not standard research protocol," Zaren said. "They're trying to take you." Veyor finally looked at him, not with confusion, with recognition. Later that night, Zaren pulled out a portable scanner he'd salvaged from the debris. It had taken days to repair, and it still blinked erratically, but it worked. He aimed it at Veyor's injured side and waited. The screen showed something that made his stomach clench. The new tissue wasn't just denser. It was laced with circuitry microfilaments woven into the muscle, running along the bone. Zaren leaned back. "You're not just a life form, you're a prototype." The next morning, they left the crater. Zaren packed what they could carry. They moved northwest, deeper into the wilderness, toward the ridge no drone had yet crossed. Veyor limped beside him, but the limp was less pronounced. For 3 days they traveled. No more machines came. No more messages. Just wind, snow, and the crunch of boots and paws on frozen leaf litter. At the summit of the ridge, Zaren paused. Below them was a basin surrounded by cliffs and old growth. No trails, no access roads, a good place to disappear. This'll do. Veyor didn't argue. Zaren used the next week to build a shelter from fallen pine and thermal tarps. He insulated the floor with fir needles and bark. Every night he examined Veyor's leg, scanning the changes. The circuitry had stabilized, forming structured junctions, a biosynthetic fusion point. "You're not healing anymore," he said one night. "You're adapting." Veyor blinked slowly. "You knew this would happen. You were designed for it." The fire crackled. Snow fell outside. Zaren looked down at his notes. "They're not trying to protect the ecosystem. They're trying to recover lost tech." Veyor didn't deny it. Zaren sat back. "That net wasn't to study you. It was to deactivate you." Silence stretched between them. Then Veyor lifted one paw and tapped Zaren's pack. Zaren frowned. "What?" Veyor tapped again, then pointed toward the scanner. "You want me to send the data?" A pause. Zaren stared at the creature. "To who?" Veyor turned and looked at the sky. Zaren followed his gaze. The stars above were clear and cold, and somewhere out there someone was watching. 3 days after they reached the basin, a snowstorm rolled in just before dusk. The wind came first, needling through layers of clothing and fur alike, followed by thick clumps of snow that coated the trees and erased all trace of their trail within an hour. Zaren had reinforced the shelter's walls that morning using a mesh of pine boughs and salvaged hull fragments he'd hauled from the ridge. It held, barely. The wind howled through the cracks, but the fire stayed lit. By morning, everything outside was muffled and white. Zaren stepped out to clear the snow blocking the air vent. His boots sank ankle-deep with each step, and he had to wedge his shoulder into the drift just to reach the tarp flap. Veyor watched silently from inside. His breathing had steadied overnight, but the burn on his side had begun to swell. Zaren brought out the field kit again and laid out the instruments on a dry plank. "I'm going to need to lance it. The tissue's too inflamed, the fluid's not draining." Veyor didn't move. "You'll feel it." "I don't have anything stronger than lidocaine, and I'm not even sure how well that affects your nervous system, but infection's already embedded." He sterilized the scalpel blade in the fire and let it cool. The burn blister had spread under the fur, forming a hard ridge just beneath the skin. Zaren checked for vascular proximity, then cut a clean line, pressing gently until fluid spilled out in a slow pulse. He flushed the area with antiseptic and packed it with gauze soaked in silver nitrate. "You'll probably hate me for this in a few hours." Veyor exhaled sharply, but didn't resist. His tail thumped once. Zaren stayed awake that entire night, checking the dressing every hour. By early morning, the swelling had receded slightly, and the discoloration began to fade. He sat back against the shelter wall, eyes bloodshot, fingers cramping from tension. "You're stabilizing," he said. "Still running hot, but your vitals are back in range." Veyor didn't respond, but Zaren knew he was listening. The creature's ears had shifted toward him every time he'd spoken that night. That afternoon, while melting snow for water, Zaren heard the unmistakable crack of something heavy shifting on ice. He froze. The sound came again, closer this time, a branch snapping under weight, followed by a low metallic hum. He crept up the slope, boots muffled by the snow. Just past a cluster of boulders, a new device hovered chest-high off the ground. Matte gray, hexagonal, and silent except for the hum. It moved slowly, scanning the area with a cone of violet light. Zaren ducked behind a tree and pulled a flare from the emergency pack. He'd hoped never to need it. He struck the cap and let the red fire burst to life, hurling it as far as he could toward the ravine edge. The drone pivoted and shot after it, light narrowing into a beam as it followed the movement. Zaren didn't wait. He sprinted back to the shelter, breath ripping through his throat. They found us again. Veyor stood, fully upright for the first time in days. The dressing still clung to his side, soaked through but intact. He moved toward the exit with a low rumble. "You're not in condition to fight." Veyor didn't stop. Zaren threw on his jacket, grabbed the transmitter, and followed. "We've got maybe 15 minutes before that thing figures out it was a decoy." They hiked fast, descending into the ravine's lower floor where the snow was packed and the ice had formed over the creek in a thick, glassy sheet. Zaren tapped the transmitter's panel until the solar cell kicked in, then flipped through frequencies. Static, more static, a brief pulse, then a voice garbled and faint. He adjusted the dial again. Another pulse. Then silence. Veyor stopped abruptly, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and tackled Zaren into the underbrush. A beam of searing blue light cut through the air where they'd stood. The drone had returned, faster and now armed with a ranged cutter. Zaren rolled, scrambling to get behind a rock outcrop. Veyor dashed across the ice, drawing the drone's attention. The beam tracked him, slicing a trench into the frozen creek. Zaren pulled the flare gun from his pack and took aim. The drone spun toward him just as he fired. The flare struck its undercarriage and detonated in a burst of heat and smoke. It reeled back, spiraling out of control before crashing into a tree with a crunch of metal and bark. Veyor limped over, chest heaving. Zaren knelt beside the wreckage. "Third one in 2 weeks. They're escalating." Veyor nudged the remains with one paw, then looked up at Zaren. "You think they're tracking you through the implants?" Veyor didn't blink. Zaren dug into the wreckage and found the drone's core, still glowing faintly. "We need to shut down whatever signal they're using." They returned to the shelter, and Zaren set up a makeshift lab from his salvaged parts. He sliced open the drone's casing, connected it to the scanner, and began tracing signal paths. The frequency spiked every 12 minutes with a low-frequency ping. He turned to Veyor. "Your implants are acting like a beacon." Veyor lay down but didn't look away. "I can disable it. But I have to remove the relay node." He sketched the node's location on a piece of bark embedded near the scapula, between 2 layers of muscle. "It's not surface level. I'll need to surgically extract it." Veyor stood and stepped forward. "You're sure?" Veyor lowered his head. Zaren sterilized the tools, laid out the anesthetics, and set up a headlamp for visibility. The incision had to be precise. Too shallow and the node would remain active. Too deep, and he'd risk nerve damage. He injected lidocaine around the area, waited for the skin to numb, then made a 4-inch cut along the muscle line. The tissue parted with a slow resistance, and he used retractors to expose the fibrous layer beneath. The node glinted faintly, nestled among muscle strands. He reached in with forceps, careful not to touch the embedded wires, and eased it out. The moment it cleared the skin, the scanner's frequency dropped to 0. Zaren sealed the wound with surgical glue and layered a pressure bandage on top. "It's done. They won't find you again." Veyor didn't move for a long time, then finally exhaled. They burned the node and the drone remains that night. The fire sparked green briefly, then settled into orange. Snow continued to fall, soft and unhurried. By the end of the week, the wound had closed. The swelling had receded. Veyor began to walk without hesitation, testing his weight on the injured leg during longer treks through the basin. Zaren rebuilt the shelter into something sturdier, using stone from the ravine walls. He constructed a chimney, reinforced the roof with overlapping bark, and fashioned a crude wind vane from hull fragments. One morning, Veyor returned from his own foray with a bundle of roots clutched in his teeth. They were edible, not tasty, but starchy and filling. From then on, they foraged together. Zaren taught him how to dig for tubers. Veyor taught him how to listen for movement beneath the snow. By the second month, the scanner showed no abnormal readings, no pulses, no tracking signals, just silence. Zaren stood on the ridge, looking out across the valley. "You're free now." Veyor joined him, fur thickened, leg healed, eyes sharp. "You can leave whenever you want." Veyor looked toward the horizon, then sat. Zaren nodded. "Yeah." "Me neither." The wind shifted, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel cold.